back here and retire. We lived 20 some odd years in Chesterfield, New Hampshire. And in Chesterfield, New Hampshire, there's a business that deals with Pontiac restorations. And they sell parts to restore your vintage Pontiacs. And some of you may remember that in 1969, Pontiac made the GTO Judge, which was their hot car to compete with the Plymouth Roadrunner. And the owner of this Pontiac business over there, he bought the old fire station in Chesterfield, in Spofford Village, and he stores some antique cars in there, and one of them is the one that he drives quite often, which is a bright orange GTO Judge. And you want to guess what the license plate says?
Here comes the judge.
It says, "All rise."
All rise.
Good thinking.
I read an article a while ago that says the U.S. has 5% of the world's population and 70% of the world's lawyers. What does that tell you? You know, Israel didn't have that problem. The family of the dead or wounded or offended victim took care of the matter, usually quickly. And I'd like you to turn to Joshua 20. Joshua 20 is the story of the cities of refuge. And it's also in Numbers 35 in maybe a little more detail. But in Joshua 20, the Lord said to Joshua, "Tell the Israelites to designate the cities of refuge, as I instructed you through Moses, so that anyone who kills a person accidentally or unintentionally may flee there and find protection from the avenger of blood. When he flees to one of these cities, he is to stand at the entrance of the city gate and state his case before the elders of that city. Then they are to admit him into the city and give him a place to live with him. If the avenger of blood pursues him, they must not surrender the one accused because he killed his neighbor unintentionally or without malice or forethought. He is to stay in the city until he has stood trial before the assembly and until the death of the high priest who is serving that time. Then he may go back to his own home in the town from which he fled." So they set apart Kedesh in Galilee in the hill country of Naphtali, Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim, Keniath Arba, that is Hebron, in the hill country of Judah. On the east side of the Jordan of Jericho, they designated Bezer in the desert of the plateau in the city of Reuben, Ramoth in Gilead in the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan in the tribe of Manasseh. Any of the Israelites or any alien living among them who killed someone accidentally could flee to these designated cities and not be killed by the avenger of blood prior to standing trial before the assembly. Now, you think about that a little bit. They could be killed prior to standing trial. That goes against our standards that we have here today. And they had set up this system. If a person kills someone by accident, or if a person kills someone by any means, it's the privilege or responsibility of the victim's relatives to avenge the death and sometimes to revenge the death. And the brothers, the father, or other relatives seized whatever was available, their swords, their axe, their scythe, their stones, whatever they could find, to seek out the person who had committed the crime. Legal authorities, police, courts, and trial were not needed. Justice was swift. Didn't need any lawyers. But if the death was an accident, unwittingly or unawares, the person could flee for his life, literally. And there were 6 towns set apart as cities of refuge, spread out among the tribes so that they were accessible. And if the person was fleet of foot enough to reach one of these terms before somebody else in the family caught up with him, he was safe. The 6 towns, they're called cities, and I don't know how you draw the line between a town and a city. You know, it's kind of like in the state of Maine, what's the difference between a pond and a lake? Where do you draw that? I've known some rather large ponds and some rather small lakes. And these are called cities, but they were basically small towns of maybe a few hundred, maybe several hundred, with walls about the village center so they could protect themselves from marauders. Not cities as we know cities today. Joshua 20 verse 4 says, when he flees to one of these cities, he is to stand at the entrance to the city gate and state his case before the elders of the city. These 6 towns were spread about somewhat equally, north, south, east, and west of Galilee. Hebron was to the south down toward the Dead Sea. And each of the towns was a Levite town. Now the Levites had their own towns. They were not given a portion of the land when the land was divided to the 12 tribes. The Levites were given cities, but they were not given towns. So they lived in these cities, and this burden was placed upon them. The towns were set apart, and literally, if you translate it literally, it means they were sanctified. That means they were, and sanctified means to set apart for holy use. And they were sanctified, set apart by God, determined as a city for holy use, as a residence for the Levites. And because they were a residence for the Levites, 6 of those cities were chosen as cities of refuge. They were more or less accessible to all 12 tribes, equally spread out. There were major roads leading to each town. They were not way up in the mountains that someone had to climb a mountain in order to get sanctuary. They were for the most part in the low hills and on the plains. And the Levites, who were priests, were used to dealing with God's laws, and they were the agents of salvation and protection. And this system was set up as a system to prevent blood feuds. You can imagine, you know, the Hatfields and the McCoys, or the Reubens and the Simeons, or whoever they were, you know, family feuds can get carried away. Now, there are numerous differences in the legal systems of ancient Israel and our society today. In the United States, you are innocent until proven guilty. In Israel, you were guilty until proven innocent. That's why they had to run. If they had killed someone, they had to run, because as far as the rules of the day were, they were guilty. And the only way you could get out of that was to flee to a city of refuge and plead with the elders and have a trial, a hearing of some sort. And there was hopefully some reprieve for the person. If they were found guilty, they were tossed back out the gate, and the family took over. Number 2, punishment today is at the hands of the law, the courts. They determine who's guilty and what the punishment is. In Israel, the punishment was carried out by the family of the victim. Didn't need the cops, didn't need the state police or the FBI. The family carried out justice. Maybe sometimes injustice, but it was up to the family. Number 3, in our system, we have fines or imprisonment, and maybe a death penalty, but it's rare in our society today. In their day, they had capital punishment or punishment in kind. Exodus 21. Exodus 21, and and this is, the Ten Commandments are given in Exodus 20. This is Exodus 21. They're explaining some of the finer points of how the law was to be carried out. In Exodus 21, beginning with verse 23. Exodus 21, verse 23, it says, if there is a serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise. If you cause someone to lose a hand, then the punishment was the same. If you cause someone to lose an eye, the punishment was the same. Retribution. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And number 4, the judge in a trial today is impartial. In Israel, the judge took sides. And he did not take the side of the accuser. He took the side of the defendant. Now, you stop and think about that for a minute. You talk about changing the whole. The judge was on the side, was there to defend and help get him off the hook. Occasionally there were cases that came to trial. A man claims innocent, runs to the city of refuge, and the Levites step in to mediate. And remember that a man was guilty until proven innocent. And again, that's a shift of thinking, and we would have to reprogram our minds to work under that system. A man is guilty until proven innocent. Now, turn to Romans 5 with me just a moment. And I want to read a couple of verses with that in the back of your mind. In your mind, that in the legal system under which they lived, that a man was guilty until proven innocent. Okay? In that context, that a man is guilty until proven innocent, Romans 5, verses 12 to 14. Romans 5, verses 12 to 14. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men, because all sinned. For before the law was given, sin was in the world, but sin is not taken into account where there is no law. That's assuming that you're guilty up front. And most of us will recognize that we are guilty up front.
Amen.
That we are assumed guilty until proven innocent. And somebody has to prove us innocent.
Amen.
When a person fled to the city of refuge, the elders met. There had to be witnesses. Deuteronomy 19. Deuteronomy 19. Verse 15. Deuteronomy 19, verse 15. One witness is not enough to convict a man accused of any crime or offense he may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. You need at least 2. Remember in Matthew 18, verse 16, I guess, yes, we'll turn to that one just a moment too. Matthew 18, verse 16, he's basically repeating what Moses said. Matthew 18, verse 16, but if he will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. This was one of the rules that they operated by. One person could not condemn. It had to be 2 or 3. And if found guilty, he was cast out of the city and turned over to the family, and it was customary for the witness to cast the first stone. This was the rule that they operated by. The witness had to cast the first stone. Now remember that when Jesus and the woman at the well, and he said, well, which of you guys wants to throw the first stone?
Yes.
They were the ones who had witnessed that we caught this woman caught in adultery. And he gives them the opportunity as witnesses to cast the first stone. There are numerous instances where it talks about justice in the Old Testament. And justice was to be administered in public. Deuteronomy 21, verse 18. Deuteronomy 21, verse 18 onward, 18 to 21. If a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey. He is a profligate and a drunkard. Then all the men of the town shall stone him to death. That's judgment. But it says they shall bring him to the gate of the town. In public, this is where judgment took place. And it was by the elders, or by the high priest, or by the judges that were established. And in the book of Judges, we have a list of people who were set aside to be judges, leaders over Israel. In Judges 10 and Judges 12, it gives a list of judges. And I'm not going to go there and read all of those today. But also, in some cases, the king was the judge. 1 Kings 3, verse 16. First Kings 3, verse 16 onward. Now, we know this story. Two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. One of them said, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house. I had a baby while she was there with me. We know that story. And this is Solomon, and he's sitting in judgment. And we know the outcome of that story. It's well known. But Solomon was the judge. And while you're there, 1 Kings 7, verse 7. 1 Kings 7, verse 7 also. He, being Solomon, built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was the judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. This was the Supreme Court. And Solomon built the building. Now, there was need for judges. They needed a judge to come and defend the people and to sort out the problems. One other verse to look at, and I'll give you a break for a minute. Exodus 18. Exodus 18. Beginning with verse 13. Exodus 18, verse 13, the next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. A lot of cases. His father-in-law saw all Moses was doing for the people and said, why is it that you're doing this for the people? Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening? And it carries on, and they appointed elders and people to serve as judges, because let's face it, Moses was leading a group of people who were living in close proximity to each other, a large group. And there was bickering and squabbles and family feuds and tribal difficulties. And it seems that there was a whole line of people coming. Moses, he cheated me. Moses, he took, all sorts of who knows what. And Moses' father-in-law stepped in and said, you better find somebody else to help sort this out. But generally, to be a judge was a coveted position. One more text. 2 Samuel 15. 2 Samuel 15. 2 Samuel 15. Second Samuel 15, verse 3 and 4. 2 Samuel 15, verse 3 and 4. Then Absalom, son of David, would say to him, look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you. And Absalom would add, if only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who would have a complaint or case would come to me, and I would see that he gets justice. People coveted the position. They wanted to be a judge. Now, in the courts today, you have a judge. Judge is supposed to be impartial. You have a jury that is to be impartial. You have a defendant who is the accused. You have a plaintiff who is the accuser. You have a defense attorney and a prosecuting attorney and witnesses. Now, Deb and I had an English teacher years ago, and Miss Littlefield was very particular about some things. And one of the things she said was, do not, this rule, according to Deb's brother, who's an English teacher, has changed, but it used to be that you could not interchange the words eager and anxious. Now, we say today, well, I'm anxious to do this. What's the word anxious mean? Anxious is related to anxiety. If you're eager, or if you're anxious. I got a phone call. Who's there? Depends who it is. I'm eager for the phone call. Who's at the door? If you're expecting the authorities to be there, you might be anxious. Now, the question is, in judgment, in our end-time judgment, are we eager or are we anxious? Are you eager to go before the judge, or are you anxious to go before the judge? Now, that as I say, the words today get used interchangeably, but if you think about the roots of them, they're not. There's a very different connotation there. Now, most of us are probably not eager to go before the judge today, and I won't ask for a show of hands of how many here have had the misfortune. And many times we're anxious about the thought of appearing before the heavenly magistrate at the end of close of probation. Sometimes we act as if God is the prosecuting attorney in the case of our salvation. But who is it that accuses us? Revelation 12:10. Revelation 12:10. I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now has come the salvation and power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ, for the accuser of our brothers who accuses them before our God day and night has been hurled down. Who is the accuser? Satan. Is it God who accuses us of sin? No. In the Hebrew system, God was on the side of the accused. God was on the side of the defendant. Different than we have to shift our thinking a little bit. But the judge was there to help defend. In the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament translation, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, Satan is translated as diabolos. Of course, we have diabolic as a word that's derived from that. And it means accuser. Satan was the accuser. And what does he accuse us of? Well, he accuses us of being sinners. He's right. He accuses us of violating the Ten Commandments. He's right. He accuses us of not being worthy to enter heaven. And he's right. But, you know, in certain circumstances today, a judge can appoint an advocate. That it's not an adversary, but an advocate. An advocate is someone who's on the other side of the adversary. An advocate is one who stands up and assists the accused. He's a court-appointed person to shed light and to plead for mercy. I had a fellow in the Freeport church when we were there who was a court-appointed advocate for youth, and you get a young fellow in trouble who didn't have much of a family to support him, and Don was an advocate, and he'd go meet with them, and he'd go to court with them, and plead with the judge a little bit, and try to get a little grace administered. Do we have an advocate? 1 John 2, verse 1. First John 2, verse 1, my dear children, I write this to you so that you will not sin, but if anybody does sin, we have one who speaks to the Father in our defense, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. Jesus is our advocate when we go before the judge. And our advocate stands up before the judge and he says, yes, this man is a sinner, but he's one of mine now. Amen. And I enter my record in place of his record. Amen. He steps up to put his 2 cents worth in, and his 2 cents are worth many millions of dollars, more than any financial. And remember that the judge is also on the side of the defendant. When you have the judge that's on your side and you have the advocate who's on your side, that seems like good news. Psalm 35. Psalm 35 and verse 22 to 24. Psalm 35, verse 22 to 24. David is crying out. Psalm 35, verse 22 to 24. O Lord, you have seen this, be not silent. Be not far from me, O Lord. Awake and rise to my defense. Contend for me, my God and Lord. Vindicate me in your righteousness, O Lord my God. Do not let them gloat over me. We're not to let Satan gloat over us and say that this is a sinner who has no hope. To plead with our advocate, to plead with the judge, because the judge is doing his best to get us off the hook. What is it that fits us for heaven? Well, it's not that we're worthy, because we're not. It's that we recognize our unworthiness and claim Jesus as our advocate, and he puts his record on top of ours. The accuser sat at the left side of the judge. The advocate sat at the right side of the judge. Ephesians 1:20, where did Jesus go when he went to heaven? Sat at the right side of the Father, Ephesians 1:20. He is our advocate. He's sitting there beside the judge. Jesus receives sinners. He sat and ate with them. And he was accused of being a sinner for doing so because he associated with sinners. Who did Jesus come to save? Sinners. Yep. And he invites us to sit down and sup with him in the kingdom. Romans verse 8. Romans verse 8. Chapter 8 and verse 3 and 4. Romans 8, verse 3 and 4. Romans 8, verse 3 and 4. For what the law was powerless to do, then it was weakened by the sinful nature, God did by sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful man to be a sin offering. And so he condemned sin in sinful man in order that the righteous requirements of the law might be fully met in us, who do not live according to the sinful nature, but according to the Spirit. The righteous requirements of the law might be met through Jesus. And there's an interesting little story. I've got a couple of more texts here. An interesting story in 2 Timothy chapter 4. Paul is writing this. 2 Timothy chapter 4. Near the end of the book. 2 Timothy 4, starting with verse 14. 2 Timothy 4, verse 14. Alexander the metalworker did me a great deal of harm. The Lord will repay him for what he has done. You too should be on your guard against him because he strongly opposed our message. Hey, this is, he's calling out and he's warning people to look out for this fellow Alexander. And then in verse 16 to 18, he says, at my first defense, no one came to my support, but everyone deserted me. May it not be held against them. Now, Paul is saying here is his defense. He went to trial and he said everybody bailed out. Nobody showed up. No witnesses, nobody on his side. Verse 17, but the Lord stood at my side and gave me the strength, so that through me the message might be fully proclaimed and all the Gentiles might hear it. I was delivered from the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil attack and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be glory forever and ever. Amen. Who came to Paul's defense? The Lord did. The Lord did. He wasn't going to leave him, even though everybody else bailed. May the Lord come to our defense, stand by our side, and bring us safely to the heavenly kingdom. You know, the cities of refuge were a place for guilty sinners. Yes. And there is a city of refuge today, and that's in Jesus. And his church, his family. That's the city of refuge. The road is open. He's never far away. He's available to each and every one of us. To flee to the refuge who is Jesus Christ. And one last verse, Romans 8:31, if God is for us, who can be against us? Let's sing our closing hymn. Number 524.